Oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah, you can get an TV. Report all the. Oh, you can check that. We had anybody like that? My life, yeah. I can't get away with it. I was there for Irish stuff, yeah, I do have the Irish
So I'll just ask you because you're most in front of me. I have a mask on. I'm used to wearing it. So do you want me to have it on?
I don't need you to have it on, and I don't think you officially have to.
No, I know that. That's not the point, though. I mean, because I'm used to wearing them and I'm happy to wear it. It's kind of your.
I don't need it until I.
Okay. Okay. Would you prefer I have a mask on, or you prefer not to? Okay. Okay. Because I can probably. Well, and when I get to the one-on-ones later, when we're talking afterwards, I'll probably put it back on. I'm used to having it on in a way, but it doesn't. The sound doesn't carry quite as well without it, or with it, with it on. So.
I'm in two choirs. We've been singing.
Yeah.
The only place you have to wear a mask now is the hospital.
There's nothing that can be done.
I just want to check with both of you. Are you okay if I do not have a mask on?
No.
Okay, because I have it long. I'm used to wearing them. So if you want, I'm
Well,
and I will. When we switch to kind of one-on-one informal things later, I'll put it back on. But I just want to check with you because you're right in front. So I'll try not to do that. All right, I just checked with everybody in the front, so we're good. So they're fine with it. You don't have to do that. So I just figured I'd check with the four right in front of me, and they said it's all fine. So
They don't always,
I don't see your official email.
It's during the day, yeah, but it can't, yeah.
Any of you could probably introduce this too, I would imagine. So that's.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the library for only our second interim Great Decisions of the year. But it's going to be absolutely fantastic. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Before we get going, I know you haven't heard my spiel since I've only done it one other time in person this year, but I did want to thank our sponsors, because without our sponsors, we would not be presenting Great Decisions to all of you and all of our online community this year or any other year, and this is our 15th year. So a huge thank you to the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Lakeshore Pax Christi. So a big hand for all of our sponsors. I also did want to remind you that if you haven't picked one of these brochures up, there is some back by the doors, and they are absolutely 100% free. However, inside, if you are interested in donating to the Great Decisions Legacy Fund, there is a form. Ideally, we would like to become self-sustaining and not have to thank the wonderful sponsors that we do. However, that's a ways off. But if you are interested in donating, pick up one of these brochures, and all the information is right there for you. Next, and almost last, if anyone is interested in the Great Decisions, not Great Donations, excuse me.
Freudian slip.
The Great Decisions companion publication to our lecture series. These are available at the service desk right by the front door. They're available for $15, cash or check. And it's a wealth of information on all 8 topics. And there is another bonus topic in the book about industrialization and where it is headed moving forward. So there is that. Quick reminder that next week we will be addressing climate change with Elizabeth Wheat from University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. This is our last in-room lecture for the year. And it's not, none of them are even COVID related. Two are geography, and one is because someone is being a good mom and taking their son around to college interviews and just on a college tour. So she will be doing it from a hotel somewhere. But so my very last thing before I turn the mic over to our excellent presenter this evening is to tell you about our excellent presenter. Lowell Barrington is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at Marquette University and a research affiliate with UW-Madison's Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. His teaching and research specializations include post-communist politics, regional divisions and political attitudes in Ukraine, ethnicity and nationalism, democratization, and political science research methods. Professor Barrington's publications include Comparative Politics, Structures and Choices, currently being revised for a third edition to be published by Cambridge University Press. He also has an edited book with University of Michigan Press titled After Independence, Making and Protecting the Nation in Post-Colonial and Post-Communist States. Professor Barrington's research articles have appeared in a variety of political science journals and scholarly journals focusing on East Central Europe and Eurasia. They include 3 articles specifically on Ukraine over the past year, published in Eurasian Geography and Economics, Europe-Asia Studies, and Post-Soviet Affairs. He is also the author of book chapters on identity, citizenship, and nationalism in both the Baltic states and Ukraine. Other than 5 years in Ann Arbor, where he received an MA and PhD from the University of Michigan, Professor Barrington is a lifelong Wisconsinite. He is very happy to be in Manitowoc tonight to discuss Russia, its relations with the United States, and its recent actions that arguably represent the gravest threat to European and global security since World War II. So, without further ado, I turn the evening over to Professor Lowell Barrington.
Thank you, and thank you all of you for being here. This is a wonderful turnout. I have, as you can imagine, been pretty busy in the last 2 weeks with events like this. Some of my favorite conversations have just been in the hallways one-on-one, so I also welcome that tonight when we're done. If you have any kinds of things you just want to talk about, I will put the mask back on and we can have those conversations one-on-one as well. So 4 months ago, when we worked on this talk, obviously I knew it would be an important topic. Did not, of course, know it would be as important as it is. A sort of former close associated acquaintance now of mine, Ian Bremer, has said the other day, what this invasion of Ukraine marked was the end of the post-Cold War period. We are now done with that. We are in a new situation of something resembling the Cold War, and we need to get ready for that. And I think one of the things, as we talk about what we can do perhaps in Q&A as well about this, one of the things I said when gas was still $3.20 or something, I saw it about $4.10 on the way in tonight. We need to be prepared for this side of this conflict. I do wish that President Biden would have been a little more forceful in telling Americans you need to start setting aside money because gas is going to keep going up and to rise as well. So with that, what I wanted to do, the original plan of about 45 minutes of presentation has been scaled back. You'll be happy to hear that. I want to sort of set the table a bit with just some overview topics a bit about Russia, a little bit at the end about US-Russian relations. But I want us to really just think about, as we move toward Q&A, how we got here, what was the buildup, what was the setting, what's the context for where we are today. One of the slides right toward the end of the presentation, I believe, is called something like, what was Putin thinking, right? Which is the most common question that I have gotten from anyone, other than what this means for China and Taiwan, which is the second most common question. But the what was Putin thinking one is a pretty central one. So as we think about like what we're going to do tonight, again, I want to say we're going to focus mostly on the post-Soviet period. Pre-Soviet and Soviet legacies are really important for understanding what's going on. If you have questions about those, I'm happy to talk about that as well. But the 1990s are as, or really more in some ways, crucial for understanding Putin and what's going on than even the Soviet period. It's kind of a forgotten decade for a lot of people who think about Russia. We jump right to Putin, or we think about the Soviet period. That period between is incredibly important for shaping who he is and his way of viewing the world. So I want to spend a bit of time on that. It also means in the presentation part, at least, I'm not going to focus on the details of the invasion. Happy to, and I guess fully expecting to get lots of questions on that in Q&A. All right, so in terms of what we need to know about Russia, first of all, Russia is huge. It is a massive country. So there's Putin admiring his massive country on the wall. It is the largest country in the world. It is over 6,600,000 square miles. It spans 11 time zones. It goes halfway around the world almost. That's important for a lot of reasons. One of them is some basic things about just how it affects it has a continental climate. Things get colder as you go eastward and northward across the continent. But one of the things about that climate is it also has had impacts on the political culture of the country and general cultural principles in terms of a kind of more collectivistic approach to culture rather than an individualistic one. As I say to my students sometimes, if you were moving into Siberia and you tried to act like an individual, you died. So there were ways that people had to work together, and it also has created really significant governing challenges. You can imagine governing this huge country as broad as it is. We have not seen much of a history of democracy across the country. So again, really big country with huge numbers of borders. I believe Russia still has the most international borders of any country in the world in terms of the number of countries that touch it. Some of that has to do, there's a couple extra ones because of Kaliningrad, this little area of Russia that's across by the Baltic by Lithuania and Poland. But it does have a huge number of countries that it borders, but relatively few ports, including relatively few, especially warm water ports, which again is a thing that Russian leaders have always thought about. It is also prone to being invaded. A couple of these invasions are particularly noteworthy that you're probably well aware of. A lot of information from things you've heard about the Napoleonic Wars and the French invasion in 1812. By the way, there's a wonderful map of Napoleon's invasion into and retreat from Russia. If you want to look it up later on at some point, it is considered the best visual display of data of any image sort of in the world that anyone has ever created. It was a map put together by a French cartographer, and it not only has dates and cities and things so you can sort of see as Napoleon's going in, the width of the line of the route in and out is the number of troops that he had. And so you start with this huge line going in, right, and it gets real small, and by the end it's just this little thin line coming back out. Russia, struggled significantly, but ultimately prevailed in that conflict. It was also an important part of the Eastern Front in World War I. World War II is, again, though, a really big thing to have in mind here. And you'll note a lot of these invasions are from the West and South, and that is not lost on current Russian leaders. We made significant sacrifices in World War II in the United States. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in World War II. Everybody in the western part of the Soviet Union knew somebody who died in World War II. And again, that lingering effect is something we need to kind of keep in mind. You also need to know Russia is authoritarian. It had a fragile democracy in the 1990s and into the early 2000s. This is the famous, by the way, you might remember this image. This is Boris Yeltsin standing on a tank during the coup against Gorbachev that also tried to remove him as leader of the Russian part of the Soviet Union in 1991. Yeltsin led the fragile Russian democracy during the 1990s. I was there in '96 to watch his re-election campaign for the whole summer. It is largely considered the high point of Russian democracy. It was not a fully free and fair election by any stretch of the imagination. So they've had a kind of, again, limited and I would say, again, tenuous experience with democracy over time. Putin has run the country since 2000 as its president. He had a brief stint before that as prime minister when then Yeltsin resigned and elevated Putin to acting president. So there's Putin. I decided to go with this one instead of the without a shirt on a horse one that you're all probably expecting, right? But there's something important about these pictures you see with him, which is that this is a really carefully crafted and cultivated image of him. His reputation before that was that he was kind of quiet, he was kind of cold, not flamboyant, not out there shooting guns in the woods and things like that. So this is something that he has worked with people around him to really cultivate, as we've seen what we call in political science, a process of creeping authoritarianism during the 2000s into the 2010s in particular, until we got to a point where all of us just started calling it a full-blown authoritarian system. There are some things that look a little bit like democracy with elections and things, but as Garry Kasparov, the former chess champion, is still one of the kind of thorns in the side of Putin. He's a pretty outspoken opponent of Putin. And he had a great quotation about Russia, which is up on my door, actually. And he said, in chess, the rules are fixed and the outcome is uncertain. In Putin's Russia, the rules are uncertain, but the outcome is fixed. And it's a very clever way of sort of saying, another way to think about it, as a former political scientist that had talked about democracy is a political system in which parties lose elections. And what that means is you have the possibility of losing in an election. Putin is at a point at which he will not allow himself to lose an election if he were to run again, which it looks like he has plans to do. One of the other really important points about the move to authoritarianism, and again, thinking back to the 1990s, I have that kind of Putin is anti-Yeltsin line there. If you ever want to think, why is Putin doing what he's doing, look back at the 1990s, look what Yeltsin did, and think, what would be the opposite of that? He has decidedly pushed in a direction that is everything different from what Boris Yeltsin tried to do with the West and with democracy and with lots of things, because he was convinced that Yeltsin had undermined Russia in a significant way, weakened its global standing dramatically, and in concert with the West, by the way, who Putin really believes was intentionally weakening Russia during the 1990s as well. The reading you had from the Great Decisions booklet talks about the idea that there really aren't any great succession plans for Putin. I think that's right, and that is one of the concerns that a lot of people have if he were to get pushed out. We don't know what would replace him. I like to say sometimes there's a point at which it can't be any worse, but we have to be careful about that. He has at least had a lot of stability in the Russian political system in certain ways. Not that makes it good in terms of what he's been doing, but we need to be a little careful about ushering him too quickly out the door. He has engaged in attacks on political opponents. The famous assassination of a prominent dissident figure pretty recently still. And so we want to have that in mind. He is not opposed to using violence for political purposes. He also is not opposed to that in his foreign policy activities. As we can talk about a little bit later too, I guess the model for what we're starting to see in Ukraine, and I got really nervous, unlike everyone else who was really excited about the column from the north that was getting stranded and not able to get into Kiev of Russian troops. The concern there is when that happened, it meant it was the end of the idea of this attack as a kind of quick attack that was going to get control of cities easily. And what the blueprint is for Putin in those situations now is you encircle cities and you bomb them. And we've seen that now for several days. That is the new strategy. And again, it's going to be really ugly. The other thing is there's been always under this creeping authoritarian period an interest by Putin in controlling information, crafting information, right? This whole work on what his image is and all that. In the last 2 weeks, this has ramped up dramatically in Russia. It is to the point of the kind of limited flow of information, I'll make some caveats in a second, to what we saw in the Soviet period. For the bulk of the Russian population right now, the main information they can get is from state-run TV and state-run radio. And that's important, again, to kind of keep in mind. Again, to the 1990s, I want to just mention that the 1990s were terrible. It was a horrible period in Russia. Significant political instability. You might also remember this. This was in 1993 when there was a constitutional crisis in Russia that led Yeltsin to order the military to attack the parliament building. All those people in front is one of these very surreal moments in Russian history. They're all just standing outside watching the parliament being shelled by the military, under Yeltsin's orders. Yeltsin sends in the military, attacks the parliament building to get control of the government away from what was a big split at that point between him and the Russian parliament. So we have this political instability. There is significant economic instability. I don't like really neat, simple explanations for things because they're usually wrong. But if you ever need one and somebody says to you, why is Putin so popular? You can sort of go back and haul out that graph is gross domestic product growth or decline in Russia in the 1990s through the 2000s up to about 2014. You will see the 1990s are all negative. The lines across, we don't have the numbers there, the lines across though are in like 5% increments. So that 1992 figure is a decline of almost 15% in gross domestic product in 1 year. That followed an equally terrible year in 1991 before that, as the Soviet Union was falling apart. So in the matter of a few years, 40% or more of Russia's economy disappears in the early part of the 1990s. There's a little bit of a hint of hope. In 97, there's that little thing that shows some growth there. None of us believe that. There was some really interesting things going on. It's something we talk about. That virtual economy term was a couple of scholars had really walked through what that growth was actually about. And it was essentially about the fact that people had stopped using currency and factories and things were just bartering with each other and they're trading things. But then on their books, they could sort of assign them any value that they wanted to because they were just trading things. And so it was a lot of weird accounting things that I don't think there was really growth that year. But even if there was, it's very limited. And then you see finally right before Putin comes to power in 1999, you see that growth. And then from the Putin years forward, again with a decline over time and the big drop in 2009, which was related to the global crisis in 2008 and 2009. But you see just how much better the economy is doing in general under Putin than it had been in the 1990s. And so for a lot of people, they still remember that. There are also a lot of social problems, continuing problems with alcoholism. Russian life expectancy, which has started to turn around a bit, had just gone through a significant decline from really the late 60s or so all the way through the 80s into the 90s. It's really hard to have male life expectancy drop as much as it did in that period of time. But it was a combination of things related to alcoholism, but also related to workplace exposure issues that we're finally catching up with people. All sorts of horrific cancers and things people are dying from the Soviet period of the approach to industrialization. So again, significant problems in the 90s that Putin essentially is kind of inheriting. And then we have, in some ways, again, I really want us not to forget about this conflict. The Chechnya conflict in the 1990s, there's two periods to it, which I'll talk about briefly. You can see there, Chechnya is in the southwestern part of Russia. It borders Georgia, near Azerbaijan and Armenia. It pushes for independence from Russia once the Soviet Union has fallen apart. And eventually Russia intervenes in late 1994, goes into Chechnya with troops, and things go really badly. What I like to do with my students in trying to get them to have a handle on how Chechnya was so shocking to Russians and to the Russian political system is to tell you a story. So imagine the United States loses the Cold War, falls apart into 15 different countries, one of which is a big chunk of the old US though. So we have the kind of northern and maybe eastern part of the United States is still the single largest big country. That's the thing that still gets the seat on the Security Council of the UN, right? So we have this big chunk of the US. New Hampshire declares independence from that country. And the remnant United States government says, that's cute, right? New Hampshire wants to be independent. Until New Hampshire starts whipping up uprisings in Vermont, they start blowing up pipelines and doing different terrorist activities to try to get the United States' attention. So the government, the president of this, again, big remnant piece of the former United States, but is the successor state in a lot of ways to the United States, finally has enough, sends in the US military into New Hampshire, and we lose. That's what happened in Chechnya in 1994 to 96. Yeltsin had to send a general down Lebed to cut a deal. He actually wasn't supposed to cut a deal, but he cut a peace deal to end the conflict in mid-1996. And Chechens have de facto sovereignty over their territory until 1999, late 99, when the Russians go back in. Putin is at that point prime minister, setting the table for when he becomes president, and he goes back in ruthlessly in a really, really horrific way, but gets control of Chechnya and ultimately wins that conflict. They go back in very soon after Kosovo. Kosovo was mentioned in the Lynch piece. I want to just have you kind of file out the way again. I think Kosovo is one of the more important things that happened in terms of military intervention that shaped Russian thinking about different things. And it would have been even more important in global situations, except for 9/11, which then reset a lot of the alliances. We started working with Russia, working with other countries, and it sort of took a backseat at that point. That is, again, the sort of second time in, and the attacks that happened the second time. All right, a couple quick things. I want you to think about the fact that we keep saying Russia. I've said it a bunch of times tonight. We have to remember Russia is a lot of different things. It's a lot of different types of people, lots of different leaders at different levels of the country. Putin is not Russia, he's Putin. He's the one calling the shots right now. This is his war. It is not the Russian people's war. The Russian people are really divided, and they're divided in terms of their views on the war in Ukraine. They're also, as I mentioned before, really divided about the information they have about the war in Ukraine. So please try to, I don't want to say again that we should be supporting people who are supporting Putin here, right? But understand why 70% of the population doesn't have a clue what's going on in Ukraine right now, in Russia. They still think it is a small, limited excursion into far eastern Ukraine. That's all they're hearing. And they believe that. So they don't understand why the West is doing all this stuff. They don't understand why we're putting sanctions on Russia. Putin is also not the Russian soldiers. It's a pretty famous in a positive way, picture. This is the woman that they captured on video handing sunflower seeds to a Russian soldier so he could put it in his pocket. Of course, he didn't do this, right? But so when he was killed and died, at least his body could fertilize some flowers, right? This is the way that Russians have been seeing Ukrainians interact with them. They're confused. There's a lot of soldiers that were told they were going in on a training exercise. This was not supposed to be a shooting war. I don't want to don't get too caught up in stories of defections and surrendering. It's happened, but it's not all of the Russian army at all. But again, a lot of them don't want to be there. They don't understand why they're there, and they have been sending messages home to that effect to parents all over Russia saying, what's going on? We're getting shot. We're killing people here. What are we into here? And of course, the parents at home are watching state TV saying, I don't know what you're talking about, right? So it's really been this sort of battle of information that, again, Putin's not losing yet, but it's not a kind of complete win. All right, on to the what is Putin thinking? First of all, we need to think about the fact that he's always very often portrayed in the West as this strategic genius. He's playing three-dimensional chess, we're playing checkers, all the stuff you've heard about him before. I can go into a little more detail that later if you want, but I mean, he's gotten very fortunate in certain ways. I've said to my students, I could have won and been a popular president of Russia after the 1990s in Russia because it was so bad, right? He walked into a situation in which the economy was already starting to recover, and it took off after his time for a few years as president. But we also have to think about even if we want to say Putin was strategic, we have to think about what he was seeing. He had very few reasons to fear that there would be significant sanctions against him. Russia invaded northern Georgia in 2008 with almost no consequences. It invaded Ukraine, took Crimea, and set up shadow governments in the far east of Ukraine in 2014 with no consequences. I shouldn't say no consequences, very few. He engaged in horrific attacks. The Aleppo attack in Syria, if you go back and look at it, it is war crimes. Definition of a war crime situation. Again, with almost no impact on him or on the Russian people, Russian economy. He had reasons to think Europe was going to be divided on this, and even leading up to the invasion, when early stage of the buildup, and then right toward the end, you still had, Germany wasn't real sure what it wanted to do. Angela Merkel's no longer chancellor. She was a anchor to Europe for a decade or more, and she is no longer chancellor. So there's this new person, and we don't know if Scholz was going to be tough or not. Putin didn't think he was going to step up and do much against Russia. Macron wanted to have his own thing with France, right? So it looked like there were some divisions, and I will say, say of all the things about this that have been shocking to a lot of people, including Putin, is how united Europe and the United States have been on this. It is a massive change from, I think, what he was expecting. What he did also have reason to fear is a Western-style democracy on his doorstep. Ukraine was not a model of a wonderful democracy. It was a functioning democracy. There's a lot of corruption problems. Zelensky has been trying, but it's an uphill battle. But he won a free and fair, essentially landslide election as president. And Ukraine was starting to openly talk about other things in terms of closer to Europe and things like that. So the other piece about understanding Putin is he is both this person who thinks rationally and somebody who can have blinders because of things he deeply, deeply believes. And those include somewhat, and I don't know what if this is he believes none of it and this is he believes all of it. He's somewhere in here about this idea that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. He believes there's this deep connection. He believes they should continue to be connected. And he therefore sort of believes that Ukraine isn't a real state and it's not certainly a legitimate state in the international system in that way. He is a full true believer about the harm done to Russia in the 1990s by US and Europe. He is a true believer that NATO poses an existential threat if Ukraine joins to Russian security. And if, I don't have the NATO map handy, but if we can picture what NATO was in 1990 and then what it looked like more recently to him as it's starting to expand up this way, it's going down this way. And again, in the irony of the things he has unleashed with this attack, I think by this summer that Sweden and Finland are going to be NATO members. I think that's going to happen. And then that adds to the sort of encirclement of Russia from NATO as well. And he is certainly a true believer that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence, or I love this term, I'm stealing this from somebody about a week ago, I heard, a sphere of control. We always say the word sphere of influence. Influence just means, you can kind of nudge the countries around you. Control is they are countries that fully support Russia, and that's what he wants to see. So with all these things, we have at the bottom of the slide there what we call in social science sometimes an over-determined outcome. There's so many things pointing toward this happening that, again, we should have seen it happening. We should have believed it was going to happen. He was telling us it was going to happen, essentially, in a lot of ways. All right, so last one is just in terms of US-Russia relations, obviously this has taken over the discussion. The war is what is driving the relations right now. There are other related things. NATO and EU expansion, again, has been a hot button issue for Putin for a while now. We also need to work on, and I hope we will get back to at some point, a new intermediate nuclear forces treaty. We both the US and Russia have backed out of that treaty. We need to get back to the table on that. In terms of sanctions, sanctions work. They work better or less well depending on other factors. So they worked at times earlier against Putin because oil prices were also dropping at the same time. One of the challenges for us today is oil prices are going up. So Putin has some extra money to kind of deal with to blunt some of those. But the steps that have been taken, I have a colleague who works on international political economy, and I said to him, I didn't see this thing coming about the US locking up the foreign reserves of Russia in the US and Western Europe doing this. And he said, I hadn't heard that from anybody. Like somebody came up with that idea at some point, but Russia had been building up this foreign reserves account with its oil sales, and it had a lot of money sitting there to help ride out sanctions, and it can't get to that money very easily right now. That was a big deal in the sanctions. And again, the other big theme is just that there has been more support and unity over sanctions than expected. Natural gas sanctions will be really hard to do. In other words, cutting off natural gas sales to Western Europe, Germany is a lot of trouble if that happens. Oil sanctions are more possible, and they're being talked about in the US. I think they are quietly being talked about in Europe, and I would not be surprised if both Europe and the US at some point cut off oil sales from Russia. Natural gas sales will be a lot harder to cut off. So, okay, so that's it for the presentation itself, and I would welcome questions that you have at this time. Yes, please. And actually, we have a mic that can come around here.
We need you to be on the mic. Thank you.
Do you see any threats or any other or any other country in NATO once he's done what he's done in Ukraine?
Good question. So those are two separate questions. let me start with the NATO one because I'm a little more confident about that. I am 99% sure that Putin is not going to send Russian forces into Poland or the Baltic states or something like that. I used to be 100% until Russian forces shelled a nuclear power plant, which was crazy. That was crazy. So that's the 1%. But again, 1% is a really big deal because if Russian troops go into Poland, they have attacked the United States of America according to the NATO Article 5 Convention and treaty agreements on an attack on one is an attack on all. That's why, again, I'm still really confident, though, that's not going to happen. It's also why, by the way, to hopefully not preempt somebody's question, but we need to be really careful about talking about no-fly zones. I know the Ukrainians are pushing the idea, Zelensky's pushing the idea. It is a horrible idea. We cannot do no-fly zones without being ready to shoot down Russian planes and probably have our jets also in the air at the same time as that's happening. So again, this is not something we probably want to push forward with. Unfortunately, I mean, it would be great if it could happen, but I don't think that should happen. The other part of the question about the other former republics is a really interesting one. There are a few things I can picture. There is, let me see if, well, so Belarus, well, yeah, we can talk about, Belarus is right now a very pro-Russian government. Lukashenko was basically bailed out by Putin in terms of protests that almost drove him out of office in Belarus, and the Russians came in and kind of saved the day for him. So he owes Putin in that way. They have an agreement in a way where they're connected. They're not one country, but they're connected pretty closely. So Belarus certainly having an even tighter relationship with Belarus is possible. I'm trying to find a good map for this. Let's do this. Okay, this one's pretty good. So, oh, I can't wander too far. On the map, you will see down in the far southern and southwestern part of Ukraine, you see where the city of Odessa is. So just to the west of Odessa, there is Moldova. And there is a river on the far east of Moldova that you can see that's sort of just inside the border, but it's inside the border. And that little strip of land there is called the Transnistria region. That's the Dniester River. And it is really important because in the 1990s, Russian army forces actually controlled that strip of Moldova. They just took it over. Lebed, who I'd mentioned before, was the general that was actually controlling the forces over that area. Russia still has troops there. They're technically kind of peacekeeping troops because it's a heavily Russian-speaking part of Moldova. That would not surprise me. Moldova's not a NATO member. It's an area they've sort of laid claim to before. That's very possible. Other things are trickier to figure out. He's already gone into Georgia. He doesn't need to do that again. He's kind of made the point there. It just depends how much he really wants to remake the Soviet Union. I don't think he does as much as he wants to collect the Russian parts of the territory. So the one that I guess I might be a little concerned about, they're fairly close in terms of allies right now with Russia, is Kazakhstan. Northern Kazakhstan's heavily ethnic Russian, Russian-speaking. I could see him make an argument for having Northern Kazakhstan. But again, I don't see this as he's trying to take over all of Europe. And again, it's just we're in a different world. NATO is a different calculation for him than if NATO did not exist. And we need to be really grateful it does not exist, or that it does exist, right? That we did not end up with a situation where where we pulled the plug on it. So
is Romania in NATO?
Yes. Yep. And so again, that's where you could see them going to Moldova. I don't even know though. Again, I don't know, right? I sort of thought for a while I could figure out Putin's brain, and then some of the things in this conflict, I'm not sure I can. But I could see pushing into Moldova. I don't necessarily get the idea of taking over all of Moldova. That there's not a lot there that makes sense for him to do that. Okay. Other questions?
Professor Barrington?
Yes.
For the sake of the people who are following along online, would it be possible for you to repeat the question that you're asking?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yep.
Your mic is the primary one for feeding online.
Perfect. Thank you.
Let's switch gears for a second. I know this isn't your area of expertise, but let's talk about China. I tuned out the news. It's so depressing. I try not to pay too much attention, but from the little I know, they've made no secret now that they are on Russia's side. Personally, I don't think Russia would have done this without the backing. I mean, can you, or do you want to speak to this? I know it's not your than you think. I mean, what about that?
Okay, right. So the question was about China and the extent to which China is fully supportive of what Russia is doing or not, and what we make of that. I will start by reiterating what you said. I'm not a China specialist, but my understanding is China well, we know publicly they committed during the Olympics and everything, and earlier things, they'd committed to this kind of closer connection, the two countries. That doesn't mean China was thrilled about this happening, or certainly how it has gone. It is interesting, let's say, that China did not issue a fellow veto vote in the Security Council on some of these things when it could have. It abstained instead. I mean, it's not voting yes, right, on the resolutions, but it didn't veto it either, which Russia did. So I think, again, we need to be a little careful that China's all on board with this. And I would say one other thing about that is that earlier comment that we are sort of out of the post-Cold War period right now. There are some reasons that China doesn't want a new Cold War, because frankly, they'd been doing pretty well in the situation that had been going on leading up to 2022. Their economy had, I mean, there had been bumps in the road. COVID was horrible for them too, right? But their economy had been growing dramatically. They had been massively increasing military spending in ways that I think a lot of people in the West weren't paying enough attention to. A lot of what China, all the action they've done in the South China Sea and building all these weird artificial reefs so they can have landing strips, right? There's all these things they've been doing, and there wasn't really any consequence for it. And so I think if they align too closely with Russia on this and really get this Russia-China thing against the US and Europe, that's not necessarily in China's interest. So yes, China loves it when we have problems. They love it when democracy has problems. And I really am not going to try to get in the head of Xi Jinping. But the unity, again, in which the United States and Europe have approached this has to be on his mind. He cannot be looking at this and thinking, I can do whatever I want, there won't be consequences. So.
Professor Barrington,
Yes.
I have an online question. Mark was wondering, in retrospect, is there anything that NATO, the West, the US could have done differently that may have averted this? Are we simply dealing with someone hell-bent on taking Ukraine back?
It's a really good question. Do I need to repeat this one, or did he hear that from you? So, or online, did they hear that?
I have it posted online.
Okay.
So they can see.
So the question is sort of what we could have done differently as NATO, for example, in the West. I think, you know, one of the things we could have done is we could have done more to help Russia in the 1990s than we did. There was a chance for a democracy in Russia to take hold. Unfortunately, it wasn't as bad as Weimar Germany economically, but there's a parallel, which is that interwar period for Germany, you put in place a democracy at the same time the economy collapses, and people associate the two. They associate democracy with economic problems. So we could have done more back then. The question is really one of, were we willing to cede a large sphere of influence to Russia so that NATO would not expand into that area? I think there's reasons for us not to have, not to go that way of just giving Russia what it wanted, which is control of this whole area. I think if countries wanted to join NATO, they had a right to do that. But we do have to understand that is the thing that's sort of moving Putin in this way of feeling more and more cornered over the last few years. And I want to remind people, he went into Georgia in 2008 because we started talking about, and the Georgians started talking about, Georgia and Ukraine joining NATO and the European Union. Publicly, we talked about it. In fact, we stupidly, I think, said to both Georgia and Ukraine, it is likely you're going to be NATO members at some point in the future, we don't know when. And if you don't know when, don't tell them they're going to be members, right? So you know, Putin had that in his mind. We were talking about countries like that right on his border, and Ukraine's big. It looks small. It looks small, obviously, in the, you know, you're looking at Russia there, and Ukraine's in the very far left of that picture. Russia looks huge. Ukraine looks small. Ukraine is, other than the European part of Russia, the largest country in Europe in terms of territory. It's a big country, and it's got a really long, big border with Russia. So again, I mean, I think that, and by the way, Finland has a really long border with Russia, and so again, if Finland and Sweden join, that puts even more pressure on Putin. So Would I say we shouldn't have brought in more NATO members? No, I think that was probably the right decision. But we had to be ready for this better than we were. He was increasingly being pushed into a corner, and that's a really dangerous place for him. There's a story about Putin and a rat. I don't know if you all know this story. So he tells a story about when he was young and he was in his apartment as a kid. There was a big rat in their apartment. And so I don't know if he had a broom, whatever he had, he sort of was going to kill this rat, and he drove it into the corner, and the rat got in the corner and attacked him. And he actually got hurt from this rat attacking him, and said, at that point I realized you can never let yourself get driven into a corner, you've got to attack first. Right? And it's a story, who knows, right? But it is something that we see with him. He doesn't like to lose. He doesn't like to admit he made a mistake. And he has taken a step that so far has not gone well for him in a whole bunch of ways. European unity is great, but again, that's a push into the corner. The struggles in the northern part of Ukraine, the military have had, which are just embarrassing for the Russian military, by the way. It's horrible. They're doing much better in the south through being a lot more brutal early on. Now in the south, you can see from these maps, this is already a little outdated. There's a little bit more control in both the north and south than this map, but you can sort of see the areas in which Russia has made gains, especially in the south, and they are moving toward encircling Odessa now, and they will probably do that in the next few days, and then start again a pretty, I would imagine, horrible bombing campaign to try to get control of that area. And if they do that, you can see once they have control of Odessa, and by the way, Kherson on the map there is really important too, the city in the south. That is the mouth of the Dnipro River that goes into the Black Sea at that point. So you have now under Russian control the entrance of the main river in Ukraine and the whole Black Sea coast except Odessa. Once they get that, they have locked off any water entry into Ukraine for supplies and things. They have to come from the west overland. So anyway, that's a long answer to that question, but yeah, please.
How can something be crafted that allows Putin to leave the Ukraine and still save face?
So the question was, is there what we call an off-ramp? Is there a way for Putin to back down and still save face? If I had that, I'd be in DC right now working for someone in the government. I mean, again, this is the problem. So early on, right, the first day of the invasion, one of the things I'd already talked about with my students is I said, there's maybe still this Ukraine is a permanently neutral country idea. That was the possibility at that point in my mind. It agrees it will not join NATO. We agree we won't try to pull it into NATO, but Russia agrees to withdraw and make no claim on Ukrainian territory. They'll never give up Crimea, so that's gone. But the rest of the territory, maybe they give back to Ukraine and they say, we'll do that because Ukraine is now neutral, it can't be part of NATO. I don't even think that's a win for him at this point anymore that he could accept. There's nothing right now that I can come up with that is a thing that he can be happy about that doesn't involve months more of just bombing the country to bits. Believe me, I've been thinking about this and hoping for something. I don't see that happening. There's little bits of hope here and there. There are talks about a ceasefire that's supposed to go into place this morning. It's already morning over there. This morning. Nobody believes it though, right? Because there's been these humanitarian corridor things that people agreed to, and there's been shelling, and so we don't know. But they have identified 5 different cities. There's supposed to be a ceasefire agreement. Tomorrow our time, but over there already today. If that happens, that's a little step, right? But that's not him at all saying we're going to withdraw. It's just saying let more people out of the cities so we can take them over easier, maybe. So I'm sorry I don't have an optimistic thing there. It's just not. It's not a great situation. We have a mic. We've got the mic here.
Since Putin came in power in 2000, this country's elected 4 presidents. How have U.S. and Russian relations differed, particularly between the Trump administration and the Biden administration?
So good question.
And maybe a little difference with the Bush and Obama.
So the question was about the previous administrations that have all dealt with Putin as leader of Russia, and whether there's kind of a pattern across those, whether they're really different. The Trump administration is the one that stands out, so I'll get back to that in a second. But both in some ways, the Bush administration and the Obama administration both had these just dreams of this reset in relations and this positive connection. You might remember George W. Bush talking about how he peered into, his Putin's eyes and saw his soul, or whatever he said, right? That there was this optimism about, we have Putin figured out, and we can kind of win him over. That didn't work. But it didn't work again in part because as we were doing that, we were also doing things like expanding NATO toward Russia. Right? So we're doing things that makes him really angry at the same time we think we're going to win him over. He is also, during that period of time up to the Trump administration, moving from a fragile democracy that he's overseeing to a full-blown authoritarian system. So that's a key sort of factor in the sense that there's not much for the Biden administration to do at this point to sort of dangle hopes of Russia becoming a democracy or whatever at this point. I need to be really careful in what I say. One of the things about being a political scientist is we take very seriously not injecting our own views into things, and we try to lay out the argument based on fact and logic and reason and observations and things. That said, I can say the Trump administration was a different situation for Putin in a few ways. One of them was he personally was much closer with Putin and sort of chummy with Putin in a way that none of the other leaders had been before that. I think he thought that was going to help, again, kind of win Putin over. I don't think that worked, but I think he thought that. Russia got involved in our politics more than it had done previously in both 2016 and 2020, and that was a kind of key difference. The biggest difference, though, and it's the biggest difference in terms of comparing President Trump to President Biden, is the relationship with Europe. So it's sort of the relationship with Russia, but in the context of our relationship with Europe. We hit by 2019, 2020, a low point in our relations with European allies. It was bad. They were really starting to talk about, we need to figure out something else to do that doesn't involve the US to help us. So again, I don't want to say that this was the Biden administration's job, and they did it perfectly and it was all on them. I think a lot of this had to do with the just blunder that Putin made. But we are, again, more united with Europe than we have been in decades over the last few weeks. Now, we'll see if it holds up. I mean, there's some still tougher decisions to get to down the road with Europe and the US. But Putin is seeing in the US something very different from what he had seen in previous administrations, partly because he is seeing Europe and the US as sort of one group right now. So, okay, other questions? What else?
Dr. Barrington?
Yes, please.
I have an online question. If I'm not interrupting.
Nope, we're good.
Okay. Barb was wondering how much oil is coming in daily from Russia into the United States?
So the question is how much oil is coming into the U.S. From Russia. The vague answer is not a lot. We get about 5% of our oil from Russia. It is not a main supplier of oil for us. Europe gets more of that than we do. That's why, again, even oil is a bit of a concern for them. But the really big one, again, for Europe, and also, again, much less of one for us, is natural gas. Germany gets something like 40 to 45% of their natural gas from Russia. They can't just sort of say, we're not going to buy natural gas from Russia tomorrow. We don't have in place the things to replace that for them. And again, they already pay higher gas prices than we do here, and their energy costs are going to go up more than ours are by some degree with anything we do in energy. It's why they've been a little slow, but it's also why it was really surprising to see some of the other things happen already, because they are vulnerable to Russia saying, we're not going to sell you these things. The problem for Putin in doing that is we have, with these sanctions, really hurt the Russian economy right now. I think the ruble hit something like 150 to the dollar today. That's a crash. It was below 100 to the dollar before this happened. I mean, this is a massive drop in the value. Their stock markets, they weren't even opening it. They were afraid if they opened it, it would crash. Right? So there, and I will say, by the way, this is also where government leads and private sector follows. Right. Some companies haven't said much or done much, but a lot of other ones are, and they're doing it unilaterally. One of the other things to think about the oil question is, in a way, it's kind of increasingly irrelevant if we do it, because some of this has already been decided. The main refinery in Hawaii and California are the main parts of the U.S., by the way, that get Russian oil. The main refinery in Hawaii just announced they're not getting Russian oil anymore. They're done. They'll get it somewhere else. So companies are kind of starting to do this. Credit card transactions in Russia right now are really hard. The credit card companies are saying we're not going to do things there. Apple has stepped up. You can't use Apple Pay. You can't use your Apple iPhone. There's all these things that are happening with individual companies, and that's great in the sense that they're not sanctions that are going to kill a whole bunch of Russians, right? They're not all going to starve and things like that. I don't think at this point of the sanctions. At some point, we have to make that decision. If we want to cripple their economy so much, we'd run that risk. But what it is it's really annoying daily life things that Russians are going through right now, and it's the middle class that's really getting hit with these right now in terms of their quality of life. And then there's the oligarchs, which is a whole different thing, and they are scrambling, they're moving their yachts, they're doing different things, and if we want to go after the oligarchs, first of all, we are still targeting way too few of them. We don't know how much Putin is actually worth. Sometimes I don't know if Putin knows how much Putin is actually worth. The guesses are somewhere between a personal wealth of $100 billion and $200 billion. That's all been just siphoned out of the Russian economy over his time as leader. He doesn't have that sitting in a bank account, right? And he has it all over the place. And the oligarchs, these different oligarchs all have chunks of this, a lot of cases, that they're holding money for Putin. But again, they also don't have the bank account sitting there with $30 billion in it. They have a primary bank account, they have other bank accounts they've tried to hide, and then they have all of the spouses, the kids, as somebody pointed out on TV the other day, the girlfriends, it sounds funny, but I mean, these are gross people in all sorts of ways, and they have spread out their money all over the place to lots of people that aren't even family members. You have to go after all that money at once. We've got to start going after 100 oligarchs and all their relatives if we really want to put pressure on them in that way. And even what we're doing has been enough to have some of the oligarchs start to say some things. Right? Deripaska and Friedman, both of whom, by the way, have Ukrainian roots. That's part of the story, but we're already outspoken a little bit. So again, I think we have a lot that we can still do. Cutting off oil would be a step, but it's actually pretty small in terms of its impact on Russia's finances. Cutting off Europe from Russian energy is a massive blow to the Russian economy, but again, I don't know how politically possible that is right now, here or in Europe, especially in Europe. So, other questions, please?
So is it only Putin or is it people below him in power that would push for this? Hypothetical question, if Putin is gone, however, whatever that means, would this continue in Ukraine?
So the question is about sort of how much is this just about Putin and how much there's sort of circles around Putin and depths under Putin that would continue the same approach to foreign policy, for example. I think there's reason to believe that if Russia were to cut a deal and withdraw, it has to happen because Putin is gone. That doesn't mean I know the views of every single person around him or below him a bit. The below him is increasingly less important as you go even one level down, which I'll come back to. But again, I can't find the off-ramp for him. So I mean, again, I can picture perhaps some other people who start to think, and there are some nationalists around him in his tight circle. And nationalists are funny because nationalists can sometimes be expansive, and sometimes they can say, you're destroying the nation with this war. We need to get back and save our country right now because you're killing us, right? So that So again, the answer is tricky because I don't know how far down we're talking about, and even his tight circle, it's tough to know what they do if he wasn't there. Let's see. By the way, if you are looking for a great book, I think it might have actually been in the recommended readings at the end of your reading. It's Tim Snyder's book called The Weak Strong Man. It came out in 2021. One of the things that Snyder does is really good. He looks at Putin through the lens of a political scientist looking at personalist autocracies in general, and what are some of the patterns that we see. And one of the patterns we see is this kind of leader who is in power for over 2 decades. There are things that start to happen, and one of the things that happen is the circle around that person starts shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and there's a smaller and smaller group of people that leader trusts. The leader starts to get paranoid. The pictures of Putin sitting 30 feet away from people at tables are kind of weird. He wasn't doing that until relatively recently. There are stories about COVID. There are stories about him being concerned that someone just might attack him in a meeting. I mean, I don't know, but it does look odd. But you see leaders get more concerned about even that tight group, who's the one that might go after them to take them out. And the other thing that you see happen is they get less and less good information. When you shrink the group of people around you and people have to fear about giving you bad news, when you say something like, to your little group of people, hey, we're going to go into Ukraine and we're going to win this quickly. Do you want to be the one in the room that says, this isn't going to be quick? This is going to be horrible and bloody, and a whole bunch of Russian soldiers are going to die, and a bunch of equipment's going to get destroyed, and here's how it's going to work, right? And you could lay that out for Putin, but of course then you worry, how does he react to that? And 10, 15 years ago, he might have said, that's great information, let's think about this more, and now that person might be killed. We don't know. But we know that people are always in these systems increasingly reluctant to give what they really have on their minds as information to the leader out of fear of how that person will react. And Putin is like that, I think, unfortunately, at this moment. Anyway, other questions?
I have another
okay, go ahead.
one coming in from online. A lot of good questions coming in online today. Dina wanted to know, given the past history, she was surprised that Chechen forces were fighting with Russia in invading Ukraine. Can you help her to understand why they would do that?
So, going back to the Chechen conflict, one of the things that happened when Chechnya was invaded was ultimately, after all this destruction, you get installed a pro-Russian government. And that territory has received quite a bit of Russian money. The buildings look pretty nice in Grozny now, as much as they looked horrible when the Russians went back in. There's been a lot of building, a lot of development, and there's a lot of people that owe Putin and people that may be able to mobilize some fighters at least to participate. So that's the best answer. I don't think there's a reason that Chechens should hate Ukrainians or anything. I think this is much more about the extent to which there's some degree of owing Putin for some of the people who are doing well in Chechnya today. And again, it's still today is a very kind of pro-Putin regime within Russia in that republic. So I've seen reports about that, and I believe them, but again, I don't want to read too much into it that they're there fully because they just really believe in this war effort. I think there's probably more going on there. Any other question here?
I'm sorry, how is it possible that Russian people don't eventually hear, even if it's just about the poisonings, about the arrests, about the atrocities that are going on? It just seems impossible to me that they would know something about it. And why would they not feel the need to work on getting rid of that?
So a couple questions there about why is it that Russians don't start hearing some of this, even through the grapevine? Great question, we'll get to that. But also sort of how they're okay with Putin. And again, one of the things, Survey data out of Russia is really suspect right now because, again, there's also pressure on you as a respondent to the survey to sort of say what the government probably wants you to say. That said, there is some sense that Putin has actually had a rebound in popularity right now. And the reason for that is what the people that are hearing on state media are hearing is, here the West goes again. NATO's ganging up on us. All we're trying to do is protect our fellow Russians that were facing a genocide in eastern Ukraine. We're there to protect them, and the West is trying to crush us again, and they're doing all this stuff, and we're going to stand up to them, though. And people are kind of rallying around that message. In the past, yes, the government did things that we know it did. The Russian citizens don't know or believe that that happened. There's a the English translation is provocation, provokация in Russian. This is a theme in Russian information about itself, which is that it deflects criticism onto the person who's making the critique and then blames them for, in fact, engaging in provocation, trying to whip up Russians to, get angry about something that they didn't even do, or provoking Russia by blaming them for something that they didn't do. And that includes the Skripal poisonings in the UK and everything else. That's how that was presented to the Russian people by media, at least the state media in Russia. Your first part, though, is a really interesting question. It's basically you can control things to some extent, and you can control information in rural areas and small towns fairly effectively today, I think, still for the most part. There's one big exception to that, which is some of them still have phones, and some of them have still been getting text messages from their kids in Ukraine in the Russian military saying, again, what the hell's going on? What are we in here? This is not what they said we were going in Ukraine to do, and the parents are struggling with the idea that that's not what they're hearing is happening. Right? So yes, you can have that happen. You can have people then in small groups. There's this tradition in a lot of countries of mothers of kids in conflicts like that sort of bond together and work together in small groups and things, and are very, very effective sometimes at getting the word out and putting pressure on the government. So I think that's a little piece, and it will get out to people here and there through what you're saying, which is just talking.
There's people coming back and forth traveling.
There's not a lot of travel right now. So even the Russians are not really going out of Russia right now, and there's not a lot of travel into Russia right now. But when the troops return at some point, they're also going to have a very different story if Putin's still in power about what was happening. The other thing, though, is, again, remember that in the big cities, it's a different story. People find information. They find ways to get it. The most important news is not that yesterday 3,000, 4,000, whatever it was, people were arrested for protests, mostly in St. Petersburg and Moscow. That's not very many people in St. Petersburg and Moscow. And even the people that want to protest are afraid. The Russian government put out a statement ahead of time as the war was starting saying, if you protest in the streets, you are committing a crime and you will be put in jail. The big part of the protests is that they continue to happen in over 50 cities in Russia. That's important. It's not the total number, it's that it's spread out. Because a lot of people in St. Petersburg and Moscow don't like Putin. Younger populations in particular, but even a lot of the big city people don't see him as going in the right direction for Russia. But again, that doesn't mean they're all going to rush out in the streets. The reason Russia acted preemptively about protests is that, and again, as political scientists, this is the kind of thing we study as well, protests that start small can get big really quickly. So you have to try to prevent them in the first place, and then you have to crack down and arrest people. So they arrested people preemptively. They detained people that might have been the people that would try to whip up people and mobilize people, because they know who those people are. But they also really grabbed and pulled off the streets people who immediately came out for some of these protests. They still have a next group and they're arresting them, and the next group and they're arresting them, but it's small. And I don't want to say this is good, right? This is a horrible thing that's happening, but this is what Putin needs to do if he wants to limit it. Because if you let it go 3 or 4 or 5 days and you don't arrest everybody, now you have 100,000 or 500,000 people in the city, in the middle of the square protesting. That's the track record of these kinds of protests. So unfortunately for him, he's doing the right thing for staying in power. But that doesn't mean long-term, though, that's still a great strategy for him. And again, the fact that there's little bits of recognition of the disinformation of the state being challenged by people coming out in the streets with what they feel is the real information, and that's spread out across the country, that's an important sign. But don't get too encouraged about that yet. They're a long way from a bottom-up overthrow of Putin. If Putin goes, it is way, way more likely it's a top-down kind of thing.
Question online.
Oh, hang on 1 second. Sorry, there's an online one.
A question online that sort of shifts gears, but in a positive way. Anne was wondering, is there a role for cyber warfare tactics from the US and Europe? And are we exercising restraint, or do we lack capability? Or is it that we fear Russia's retaliation? So, really loaded question.
So the question is, in terms of cyber, why do we appear not to be doing anything? Are we afraid? Are we incapable, et cetera? I don't think it's any of the three things she mentioned. I think we are doing it. I don't think we're talking about the fact that we're doing it. We are certainly taking preemptive steps to try to prevent cyber attacks on us here, but I would be stunned if we are not engaging in activities to disrupt things in Russia. And what's so interesting about that, right, is we for good reason, we get really focused on the physical conflict, the tanks and the troops and the guns and the bombs, for good reason, right? But the whole cyber piece has to start getting figured out pretty soon in terms of how it counts in all these things. We were attacked through cyber attacks repeatedly from Russia over the last decade or so without, again, massive consequences. There were some targeted consequences, but not massive consequences for that. So, you know, if Russia engages in a massive cyber attack that wipes out the entire electrical grid in Poland, for example, right, is that an attack on NATO? Right now, we don't think of it that way. But I mean, there's a point in time in which we need to start thinking about cyber as an attack in the same way we think about, you know, troops on the ground as an attack. But again, if we are not engaged in disrupting Russia through cyber, we're not doing our job right now. I think they're trying to do it to us without a lot of success, which is good news for us. I also have to be very careful about how I talk about this. I have reason to suspect that we are a lot better at this than people think that we are. I'll let you think about that. So, I saw a hand in the back before. Can we go back? Oh, sorry. Oh, you have first. Yes, go ahead. That's right.
I may not be putting the terminology right, but Putin put us on nuclear arms alert or whatever at the very beginning. Do you think Putin would really think about it?
So this is my 99% 1% comment again, but just as I said about attacking a NATO country. It was 0% until, again, they actually fired munitions at a nuclear power plant. So there are other people who study this more than I do in terms of the tactics that Putin might use and what weapons, who are concerned about tactical nuclear weapons being used, the sort of battlefield small, no nuclear weapons small, but the less horrific battlefield weapons being used. Again, I can come up with reasons for that not to happen. And they include that would be the next round of sanctions from the US that Russia hasn't seen yet. That has to be a line that is crossed, that we throw everything, and Europe at that point says, okay, we're dealing with $10 a gallon gas. This guy's got to go. The other reason I'm thinking he does not want to probably do that is one of the other things about these kind of leaders, they are sometimes reluctant to take the really big step, and we know Putin is actually pretty risk tolerant. Like he does risky things, but the really big step if the order may not be followed. So if he gives that order to launch a tactical nuclear weapon, and the people on the ground and whatever the rank the person is that has to make that decision in the actual situation says no way, that regimes that have had orders disobeyed like that can sometimes go really quickly. And I'll say again, I'm not predicting he's going to be removed. I told my students, though, I've had a very interesting transition over the last week where I was 0% that this was going to cost him his position as leader of Russia. And then about 3 days into the war, I actually said in class, I said, all right, I'm at 10%. It's 10%. And then 2 days ago, I said, I'm at 20%. And the students got kind of excited. I said, calm down, it's 20%. I didn't say 80%, right? I said 20%. But one of the things about these kinds of systems, and it's because, again, the circle's real tight and information's hard to get, and nobody wants to give the leader bad news and things like that. They look really strong and stable until they're not. And what I mean by that, and I came up with this analogy on the fly, and I'll just go back to it. It's not probably great, but I said, imagine these kinds of systems are like this dome, and you're standing up on a hill, and you're kind of looking at this dome, and it looks like this super strong, solid dome that nobody could ever get into. And then this pigeon flies and lands on it, and the whole thing goes like this. And it's because what we don't know, well, we know that some of the institutions within Russia are pretty weak because Putin has weakened them. So what we don't know is how much kind of rot there is under that system. And part of the problem for Putin is he doesn't know that because nobody wants to tell him. So again, he may make that kind of mistake. If he does, then I go from 20% to 60%. I mean, if the United States isn't on the, we are already setting up channels to the Russian leaders of their military with our military leaders. This is really important step. It's the, what do they call it? The sort of de-escalation, whatever it's called. But basically, it's like you have a direct line so that if there's something that looks like it's about to be an accident involving Poland or something, right? We can talk to each other and say, hey, back, get out, right, stop. But there's also some back channels probably in people in the government. If he uses a tactical nuclear weapon and we are not on the phone with some of those high-ranking military and civilian people in the Russian government saying you have 48 hours to get rid of this guy, then again, we're not doing our job. I mean, that's a line that we can't allow to be crossed. Now, it doesn't mean we should attack them. I mean, this is the whole reason we are not going to do no-fly zones and we are not going to put U.S. troops in Ukraine is because Russia has nuclear weapons. If you look at the conflicts in which we have engaged in conflict with countries, it has never been a country with nuclear weapons. We attacked Iraq and really, really thought they had chemical and biological weapons. They didn't really, but we really honestly thought they did, and we still attacked. We have not attacked North Korea, right? We have not. The nuclear piece is such a different discussion that we're not going to do no-fly zones and we're not going to put troops in Ukraine because we can't risk a nuclear exchange with Russia. We can't. But again, it's also a line too far for him to take that kind of stuff. And so were he to do that, and the order is followed, again, get ready for the sanctions that we have not even thought of yet coming out on Russia within days. I mean, it will be, everything gets thrown at them then at that point. So, here, there's a question back, I think. Yeah.
So if they left Ukraine because there wasn't no movement
or he just decides to, right? Let's say maybe that could happen. I don't know.
Do you foresee sanctions immediately being lifted or the squeeze be left on for quite a while?
That's a really good question. I think it again depends if Putin is still in power or not in power. If he's not in power and there's a new government that is committing to withdraw troops and there's some kind of territorial agreement, we probably end the sanctions pretty quickly. There's not a reason at that point to continue to put pressure on the government. If Putin's still in power, again, we may try to continue to keep the pressure on him. But again, we have to give him incentives. There has to be something that he gets out of it if he were to take that step, or whoever the leaders are. We've got to give them, we can't just say, good job, congratulations, you've withdrawn from Ukraine, but no, we're still going to hammer you with sanctions, right? I mean, that's not how to work with that new regime in Russia, if there is one. So I would expect that we would drop those pretty quickly, actually. And again, that's part of our hammer of sanctions, right? It's you're hurting now, and you're holding also the carrot of not doing them if there's a change in behavior. So, other questions? We have somebody in front.
Where
are we? Oh, please, go ahead.
And this is changing up, and it's changing up
into your hard area of expertise, China. Kind of question. Project Syndicate columnist Nina Khrushcheva asserts China will exploit Russia's isolation and the weakness and vulnerability that comes with this isolation, and that China will neither risk its own prosperity by channeling the U.S. in defense of Russia. What are your thoughts on this? Has Putin been duped by China?
So the question is there a reason for us to think that this agreement between China and Russia to sort of support each other is a pretty fragile agreement? Yes. I think if Putin thinks that she would not throw him under a bus in a heartbeat if he thought it helps China, he doesn't understand the Chinese leader. So if we are able to cut a deal with China to isolate Russia further, and the calculation for China is that is a huge win for us in terms of our foreign policy goals, China will do that. Now, China needs Russian energy, so there's also that piece of it. I mean, that's one of the things that there is a slight reciprocal relationship in that way. But again, China is about China. And again, I can't believe Putin wouldn't know that, but again, you can be fooled sometimes by thinking, I mean, look, Stalin believed that he and Hitler had this special relationship until Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of the world, in World War II into the Soviet Union. So leaders sometimes think they have a connection and it doesn't last. And Putin needs to be really careful if he thinks China will have his back in all of this, no matter what he does. I don't think that's true.
Question.
If we have another level of sanctions that we could implement, another higher level of sanctions, why won't we do it now, put more pressure on them, and what types of sanctions would those be?
So the question is, if we have another wave of sanctions to use, why are we not doing it now? The reason we're not doing it now is I think the calculation is it's not politically possible in the United States or Europe to do. So this would involve President Biden going on TV to the American public and saying, gas is about to go to $8 a gallon, maybe 10. Get ready. Because that's the kind of, like, if we want to actually really cripple Russia's economy, we have to be able to tolerate that, and we have to start providing massive aid to Europe and other countries that are going to deal with energy prices that they can't handle right now, so or wouldn't be able to handle in terms of what they would have happen. And we've also got to find them suppliers. I can't believe that Putin has not noticed that U.S. government officials were talking to Venezuela. They were quietly talking to Iran, and we are about to send a delegation to talk to Saudi Arabia. Now, one of the things about this conflict is we need to, if we want Putin gone, potentially, accept some short-term, really uncomfortable, icky feeling alliances. And, that may be, we actually have to work with Iran. We may have to work with Saudi Arabia. And we may even have to work with Venezuela, right? Because that's some of the places where we could get some of the energy that we need to get to Europe and things like that. Although, again, the natural gas piece is still a really tough thing for us to figure out. We're trying to figure out how to get liquefied natural gas. Anyway, there's things that we can try to do. But the answer to your question is, again, those steps are steps that would have such an impact on daily life in the West that right now they're just not on the table. But again, if we get to that point, it means something has really happened to put them on the table that is not a good thing. So
You can't take it.
Can I go?
yeah. Yes, one more. Yeah, please.
I had a question from John, who wondered, will the United Nations ever have a role in this conflict, in particular if Putin is accused of war crimes?
So the question is about whether the UN has a role in the situation about Putin and the Commission of War Crimes. The International Court in The Hague is actually already taking up an investigation of war crimes in Ukraine, so that will move forward. We have interestingly been a little reluctant to say it out loud, at least from President Biden. The US Embassy in Ukraine said it. And then apparently there was kind of a communique to a whole bunch of our embassies around the world saying, please don't say that again. But ultimately, that is a step that has to happen. And we have to be willing as a country to call it out and say that. And it has to happen for a couple reasons. One is just because it's the right thing to do. War crimes are war crimes, and they have to be labeled that way. The other reason is it goes back to that, am I going to follow orders as a Russian general or colonel or something on the battlefield? It doesn't typically go well for those people when they say after the war, I was just following orders anyway, but it really doesn't go well if there's a public declaration by the world that those are war crimes, and then you still follow the orders again later, right? So, I mean, I think that kind of, it's beyond naming and shaming, because it's not just a sort of shaming effort. This is a calling it what it is. It's a war crime to intentionally target civilian areas. And by the way, there are no happy stories here. I myself have been caught up in the emotion of this in a lot of different ways, including people I know there. But, you know, the Zelensky story is incredible. Here's this actor nobody took seriously. Putin didn't take him seriously. His own people voted him in office and still didn't kind of take him seriously, who has been heroic, right? And the Ukrainian people themselves have been heroic. But they are outmatched. They can continue to struggle and survive quite a while. And ultimately, the most likely outcome of this, unfortunately, is ultimately Zelensky stepping down for the good of the people because they're dying by the thousands every day at that point or something. And then Putin gets his sort of victory, right? And he puts in place this puppet government. And then that government has a decade of just hell every day trying to hold on because the Ukrainians are going to keep fighting. And it's going to be, again, horrible. And one of the things that we need to remember about this, too, is they are put in a position where when you're outmatched like that, you do really ugly stuff, too. So, you know, expect that there will be an insurgency if that puppet government is established that engages in terrorist-like activities, and we have to decide, you know, is that okay? And are we going to keep supplying them with weapons and things to do that? But, you know, war is horrible, and it's ugly, and a lot of people are dying right now, and a lot more are about to die, I'm afraid. Russia actually, in the first few days of this war, was relatively restrained with what it did. It was using fairly highly targeted missiles and things. It is starting to not use those. It is just shelling. It is sending rockets that aren't terribly accurate. Somebody asked kind of rhetorically the other day, is Russia just a really bad shot or don't they care? And the person that they asked said, yes, like both of those, because they're using munitions now that are not terribly accurate, but they don't care. They're going to keep using them. So again, it's going to be really bad, and we're going to have to decide what is, you know, what can we continue to do, and what can, you know, how can we help out the Ukrainians? But again, unfortunately, the most likely outcome is ultimately Zelensky may have to resign for just the sake of his own people. There's a point at which, as a leader, and he's there, he's still rallying people. They're doing great in certain places. They've won victories. They've had Russian troops surrender, right? But there's a point at which, when Kiev is encircled, and I hate saying we haven't seen something yet, because whenever I've said that 3 times and it's happened, then except I never said it at the nuclear power plant, never thought that would happen. What we have not seen yet is really the bombers flying over the cities and just dropping bombs. But they did that in Grozny, they did it in Aleppo. That is a stage at which we are going to see them probably just pummel cities at some point. And the other thing I'd be a little careful about is being too romantic about the people who are making Molotov cocktails with bottles in their apartments. Because when I saw that, I first thought, wow, that's interesting and good for them. And my next thought was, and if you're Putin, those aren't civilians anymore. Those are combatants. And that apartment building is a military structure at that point. Right. So again, I mean, just be aware it's bad already, but I'm afraid it gets worse going forward. So let's see, you had something before, right? Did you?
Well, I was wondering about the Ukrainians themselves.
Okay.
And you rather addressed it.
Well, I will say so the question was kind of about the Ukrainians and how they're doing and things. And look, they're really tough people. One of the things that's very interesting about this, so I do a lot of work on Ukraine, had 3 articles last year come out of Ukraine. They've all been from survey data that we collected in Ukraine. And it was relatively recent, but one of the things we can do is we can go back and look at survey data before different periods of time in Ukraine. And one of the things that has happened, let me get the right map up for this. So there is a tendency for people sometimes to see the Dnipro River that runs through the middle of Kyiv in the north there and it goes down to Kherson in the south, as this kind of magic east-west dividing line, right? And you've heard the sort of east of Ukraine is all Russian and Russian speaking, and the west is Ukrainian and Ukrainian speaking. The better way to think about Ukraine is when you look at survey data, what you see is people in the far west were quite different from people in the far east. But that doesn't mean it just magically changed at the Dnipro. There was kind of a blurring across the country when you got to that point about the east being really different from the west. So that's kind of part one. Part two is that the 2014 invasion and the seizing of Crimea and the establishment of the People's Republics in the far east of Donetsk and Luhansk changed people's attitudes in the country, so that to the extent that there was this blurring in the middle of the country, that whole line, wherever that was, pushed eastward. So way more of the middle of the country and still the far west were looking at Europe and not Russia. And even people in the far east of Ukraine started looking toward Europe instead of Russia. The 2014 invasion did a lot of damage to people's sense of connection in Ukraine to Russia. Imagine where they are today in their views of Russia. So this is a situation in which wherever this line is magically where it kind of moves from being the majority look at, west as the way we should look versus east and Russia, that line has moved dramatically eastward in Ukraine. And one of the things that's interesting is when you do survey data, you get demographic data, right? So you get demographics about the population that you have done the sample with. And one of the things we found we're looking at it is we're thinking there aren't enough ethnic Russians in this sample, and there aren't as many Russian speakers in this sample as we thought. And then it turns out that a couple things are happening. Well, first of all, there's an easy answer. The People's Republics part of Donetsk and Luhansk were not in the survey because we couldn't survey there, right? So we lost some of the people who'd be ethnically Russian there. But the other thing that's happening is people self-reporting their ethnic identity were starting to not say just Russian, they were starting to say Russian and Ukrainian. Or some of them were even starting to say Ukrainian. When you asked them what language they were using in their daily lives, some of the people who had said a decade ago, we speak Russian at home, we speak Russian at work, whatever, were saying we speak both, or we're saying we speak Ukrainian. So, and again, that was just what had happened in 2014. So if you think about what is happening to the sort of attachment to a sense of Ukraine that is not Russia with this invasion, again, Putin did not know what he was getting into in that regard. And I've kind of joked with my students, he needs to read social science, and then he would, he would have seen this survey data and he would have had a sense. But he didn't, and I think, again, he had these blinders about Russians and Ukrainians have this deep connection and they're kind of one people and all that, and he believed that. And if you ask a lot of Ukrainians right now, they are not happy to talk about the concept that they are one people with Russians right now. And the last thing I'll say is, I don't know how this is breaking down today. Even in 2014, there were ethnic Russians fighting for Ukraine against the separatists and Russian troops in eastern Ukraine. So the idea that sort of all the ethnic Russians are on the side of Russia was not even right 8 years ago. And it's certainly probably not right today. We've heard people who are just self-described Russian speakers and even ethnic Russians who are fleeing their cities saying, they've destroyed my town, they've destroyed my city, what are they doing? So again, that's why he could install a government and tell it to try to keep control of that country. I've said before in the last week, that next 10 years for whether that's a Russian occupation, the estimates are all over the place about how many troops Russia would need to actually fully occupy and control Ukraine as opposed to do it through a puppet government. The best estimates I've seen are probably 500,000 to 600,000 troops that they'd permanently have to station for some period of time in Ukraine to just control it in a way that they need to control it. So you can try to give this puppet government the chance and you say, okay, we're going to leave a lot of troops, but not that many, but you're going to also be ruthless and all that. But I said, this is the US in Iraq and the Soviets in Afghanistan all wound together. I think the one difference is we got control and the Soviets got control way more quickly than Russia was even getting control of the first place of Ukraine here. But it's going to be horrible for that government. And again, Putin, I don't think thought that. I think he literally said at one point, basically like, we're going to be welcomed with flowers in Ukraine. Right? So again, that's, I think part of him at least believed that. Oh, hang on, do we have an online one?
I believe this is our last online question. Eastern Ukraine, and I wanted to know, has been smoldering for years. Are there any other places that are smoldering right now and ripe for escalating conflict in Europe or elsewhere?
That's a big question. So one of the things about the comment I started with about this, we are no longer in the post-Cold War world, is there is a pretty hard line at this point. So anywhere along that line of, Russia and eastward and NATO and sort of westward, sure, there are parts that I worry about because it involves the border with NATO. I spent some time in a city called Narva, which is in far eastern Estonia. It's on the river that divides Estonia and Russia. And the population there was pretty ethnically Russian in Narva. And so there are areas at which Putin, again, could picture, well, just across the border, there's a lot of ethnic Russians. But again, that's a NATO country. So I don't think he'd do that because, again, if he does, we're in just a different world at that point. It's no longer, we're not in the post-Cold War period. We are in a hot war with another nuclear power at that point. So we hope that he doesn't have aspirations for that. But I guess the other one I'd go back to that I mentioned is just that Transnistria region of Moldova. That seems to be a pretty reasonable one to expect something to happen in. That would require Russia to get control of Odessa and then go kind of upward that way. But again, I think unfortunately that's going to happen. At least that they'll get Odessa and get that area north of Odessa as well. So where's the microphone? Oh, right, there's some right behind you. There you go.
Now we're talking about energy. Now Biden shut United oil manufacturers down when it comes to the pipeline that he decided not to continue with and everything. If he picked that up, do you think we have a lot of worry about energy?
So the question was about whether we need to, or whether the Biden administration should or would do things like reopen the Keystone Pipeline plan, things like that, right? We could do that. You don't just sort of put on. I mean, there's a process and there's time. And one of the things right now is everything is so fast. I mean, the way that sanctions reactions came together as quickly as they did was just stunning in some ways. So we could talk about that, and some people are talking about that clearly within the government about the extent to which we might open up more production in the U.S. The other thing we need to figure out how to do is one way or the other, whether it's that or whether it's a massive investment in clean energy to desperately try to catch up to China, which is so far ahead of us right now. We need to think about ways in which we don't have to be dependent on autocratic governments with oil, right? I mean, whether that's more of our own or clean energy or both, this, if nothing else, needs to show us that being that dependent on not pleasant countries for our energy is not a good thing. And Europe has to do it. This is the biggest thing. Again, we're way more energy self-sufficient than Europe is. We import, but I mean, we're still close. We aren't that far from being an exporter. Europe is not close to that. They are very dependent on other people's energy, and they're trying. They're moving toward clean energy things, but again, they're behind where even they should be right now. So, good question.
Follow up from this lady, probably about a half hour ago, talking about information. Do people in Russia have access to the BBC, the Voice of America, and other less tainted sources or more truthful sources of information?
Right. So the question is sort of who in Russia has access to Western information, BBC, things like that. Some people do, and again, it's mostly people in the big cities that are doing it through social media videos, through internet connections that they can try to get for a while, things like that. Russia has been really cracking down on that, though, and there had been under Putin some functioning independent news organizations. They always were a little bit nervous about what they could say, and there's a little bit of self-censorship, I would say, but they were genuine, at times, critics of the Putin government. The last of those, in terms of the independent TV, and the last of those, the independent radio, have been shut down. So you don't have that local voice there. But again, the vast majority of the population is not hearing the BBC. They're hearing state Russian media, and that's why it's not it's not even that they're supporting Putin in the war effort, they're supporting what they think is going on, which is not what's going on. And that's where, again, we just need to be careful about assuming the Russian people, quote unquote, are all supporting Putin. They're supporting a vision of what they're hearing, or a version of what they're hearing, but, and it's not what's actually happening. So if we have time for maybe one more, and then what I want to do is also be around, though, to just sort of talk one-on-one with people afterwards, if that's okay as well. So, please.
I heard some speculation that Russia could be declared a state sponsor of terrorism. Is that possible? And if that happened, what would the consequence of that be?
So the question is whether we would declare Russia a sort of state sponsor of terrorism, and if so, what happens there? The impact of that would not be as great as you'd think, because a lot of what we do when we have that designation is it allows us to do certain kinds of things that we're kind of already doing against Russia with the sanctions and things like that. But it would be important, again, as a message. I don't know that it is any more important than it would be to call Putin a war criminal. Because the saying you're a state sponsor of terrorism is still sort of saying other people are kind of doing it, you know, like you're supporting them, you're funding them, you're doing things, but it's kind of other people. Saying Putin's a war criminal is this is his war, these are his decisions, and I think that that's as or more effective than that designation. I'm not opposed to it if they have the evidence to make that in terms of how it's defined, that's fine. But ultimately what we need to do is expose, and this is tough because the reporters are fleeing too right now, as they should be, because their lives are on the line if they stay. But we have to keep documenting what's going on to make the war crimes case, which I think is ultimately going to be the bigger one in terms of a threat to Putin. So that, again, that's how I would answer that. I think that's where our attention needs to be about the collection of evidence and the moving forward with those kinds of charges as an international body, an international community.
So they would get kicked out of the United Nations.
Well, there are things that can happen, but again, the problem for them is that being a veto power member of the Security Council allows you to do certain things that you can't do if you're a regular country. And so they may be able to shield themselves, the UN, in a lot of different ways with that.
And unfortunately, that is all we have time for this evening. Thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you.
Please join us online next week and the weeks after that. Next week is climate change. So have a great night, everyone, and thank you for coming.
Go blue.
Oh, good for you. Well, I'm actually, as I said, as Jim said, I'm a lifelong Wisconsinite, but I am, and so I still kind of, if I went to Madison, so if Madison's playing Michigan, I still kind of root. Right. So I just remember walking in and going like this, and you just look, and it's just this massive thing. But no, Ann Arbor was a great time for us. Yeah, so thank you for being here. Appreciate it. So, by the way, I'm going to do this because
enjoyed it very much. You did a very good